Welcome, welcome. Glad that you guys are here tonight. So if you've been with us for the past couple weeks, you know that we're in the midst of this series that we're talking about being bold about your faith, right? Roar, bold as a lion. And we've been talking about how to take a stand and how to speak up and how to not be ashamed about what you believe. It's important. I mean, think about, this is something, our faith is something that it's a big deal to us. And if it's a really big deal to us, then we should be willing to speak up for it and stand up for it, to take a stand. And so that's why we've been in the midst of this series, right? But boldness, it isn't always easy. You get that. You understand that, especially when you're trying to navigate social media, trying to navigate this world as a teenager. What does that look like? How am I supposed to be bold here? How do I take a stand here? It can feel pretty risky at times as well, where you're just like, I don't know about that one. And so far in this series, we talked about Daniel, and a couple weeks ago, I talked about Daniel filling up on God first, right? That was our big idea, where we had these food options laid out in front of him, where the king had taken him and said, hey, you're going to eat all of this stuff. And Daniel was like, no, I need to stick to what God has commanded me, and we're only going to do this. And he was bold about his faith and understood I needed to fill up on God first. And I gave you this example of Chick-fil-A sticking up for their standards and their beliefs, where they said, I don't care that the Super Bowl is coming to town, we're staying closed. I don't care how much money we're going to lose out on, we're staying closed, right? And then last week, Josh did an awesome job walking us through this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we saw this play out in front of us in this crazy scene where he builds this giant statue and says everybody has to bow down and worship this 90-foot golden statue. And these guys were bold about their faith, and they said no. And then we see that this big idea from that is about being bold together and the power of that. And it was such an awesome lead into our first night of Sunday night groups, because that's such a critical place where you can find that togetherness. Man, being bold by yourself is incredibly difficult. Being bold together, it's still hard, but it's a lot easier than that boldness it takes by yourself. And yes, as we closed that night, we kind of did something a little bit different, and you guys went off to where kind of high school guys and high school girls and middle school boys and middle school girls, they were all, and you kind of looked at each other and you got to pray for your schools, and you saw like, okay, we go to the same school, and there's something about that being together. But I can't tell you enough that the value of our Sunday night groups, you really want to be bold together, you're going to find that togetherness at Sunday night groups. Not just here for 30 minutes, for an hour and a half on a Wednesday night. But Sunday night is where you're really going to find that togetherness that we're looking for. Well, tonight we're going to jump back to the story we're going back to Daniel, but we're actually going ahead decades and decades and decades in time. Okay, so we're going to look at Daniel again, but we're going to jump ahead a lot of years. And Daniel once again risks everything in order to take a bold stand about his faith. Now, just like last week, a lot of you are going to know the story that we're going to talk about tonight. In fact, I think so many of you know it, that I want to go ahead and get somebody to give me a rundown of this story real quick. So who would be willing to just kind of stand up and loud enough so that everybody can hear, tell me the story of Daniel in the lion's den. So, all right, Jed, no, you're good right there. Just, what's the story of Daniel in the lion's den?
The king said, anyone who does not pray to me gets thrown in the lion's den. This guy, Daniel, says, hey, this dude prays 3 times a day to our God. So king says, all right, it's the lion's den. Lion doesn't know Daniel.
Boom. All right, shut it down. See you guys. Y'all have a good night. All right? Yeah. So, if I were to kind of like do a poll, so many of you know that story. Some of you maybe here, you're like, I've heard this story like 100 times. Why are we talking about this tonight? Others of you right now are going like, wait a second, rewind. Like somebody got thrown into a lion's den? Like what happened? Why did they get thrown into a lion's den? What's the deal? Like, people have dens of lions? Like, this is kind of a crazy story. But sometimes these stories, if we've grown up in church, we get kind of desensitized to them, and we kind of lose the understanding of like, wow, this is like a really big deal. And so tonight, man, wherever you're at, I pray that you stay locked into this story, because even though it took place thousands of years ago and seems like this has nothing to do with us today, I'm telling you, you couldn't be farther from the truth on that. There is so much happening with what we're going to walk through tonight that's playing out all around you. And we all need to get this big idea. The big idea that I want you to grab a hold of tonight is choosing peace in the pit, okay? Choosing peace in the pit. At one point or another in life, we're going to find ourselves in a pit. Probably not with lions, but we're going to find ourselves in a pit. And how we respond to that is everything. And so what does it mean? How did Daniel choose peace in the pit? And what does that look like for us? What does that look like for you walking through middle school, walking through high school? So, if you were with us for weeks 1 and 2, you know a little bit about Daniel's story, but I'm going to give us a quick recap in case you weren't with us. Let me pray and we'll jump in. God, thank you for the opportunity to just be here tonight. Thank you that we have the freedom to be in this building, to just talk about you freely and openly without worry of somebody throwing us in a den full of lions or throwing us in a fire like last week. God, I pray that you would speak through me in a powerful way tonight. Help me to convey your message and your words, not mine. In Jesus' name, amen. So, Daniel was a follower of God, right? But his people are captured by this king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, and he takes over the country and he says, all right, I'm going to take some of these guys, I'm going to take them with me. Daniel's one of these guys that he takes back. And Daniel and his friends, they stay true to God, and they continue to actually grow in favor with the king and everything like that. And it's going really awesome. But then things get a little bit heated, right? Literally, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We've got this story. Everybody's got to bow down to the idol. They don't do it. And so then they get thrown into this fiery furnace. But God miraculously intervenes, and they survive. And as a result, the king praises God. And these guys continue to grow in their influence and in their positions within the government. And over again, these followers of God take a bold stand. And over again, God blessed them and protected them. Now, over the years, control of Babylon is handed down from King Nebuchadnezzar to his grandson, Darius, okay? And so, but Daniel continued to gain more and more influence in the kingdom. And as a result, some other dudes begin to get a little bit jealous of Daniel, right? They wanted his position. They wanted his authority. So they banded together to find a way to take Daniel down. And that's where we're going to pick up our story in Daniel 6. So if you've got your Bibles, turn to Daniel 6. It'll be on the screen as well. We're going to start off by looking at verses 1 to 9 here. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. All right, so giant kingdom, I need to divide this up. So there's going to be 120 people over all of this territory. And over those 120 people, there's going to be 3 people, right? And Daniel's one of those 3 people. So that the satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. The king's like, man, this dude is awesome. So instead of just being like on equal ground with these other 2 guys, I'm actually going to make Daniel a new position. He's going to be second in command for the whole kingdom, and everybody else is on. The only person above Daniel was going to be the king, is what this guy's thinking. He planned to set him over the whole realm. The administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. But they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, we will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God." So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said to him, "May King Darius live forever." All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as the law of the Medes and the Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed. So King Darius signed the written edict. So, unfortunately for Daniel's enemies, Daniel hadn't done anything wrong, which meant they needed to come up with some kind of scheme to gang up on him, to take him down. And to do that, they decided to take advantage of his belief in God. Now, we don't necessarily know exactly why these guys hated Daniel or why they were trying to do this. Some people think that Daniel was so clean that he was messing up their corruption, right? These guys wanted to be corrupt because they knew this is a good system where we can pocket a lot of money. The king still gets his, but we get a little extra on the side. But because Daniel was so clean, and if he got an authority above all of them, it was going to be even harder for them. So he's messing with their money. Other people just think these dudes are just jealous. The king likes him more, he keeps getting elevated, and they're just like, we don't like this guy. Whatever it is, they're like, we've got to find something against him, but they can't. So they go, you know what? The only way we're going to do this is if we figure out something against him and his God. So how can we do that? And so because of their jealousy, these men convinced the king to create this law that specifically was targeting Daniel and his beliefs. And the punishment is death by lions. Death by lions, right? Now, you may be under the illusion we don't really live with lions here in Bedford, Virginia, right? So we don't see them very often. You know, you may be under the impression that lions are pretty cute and cuddly, you know? Like, aw, like, yeah, right? Oh, that's cute. Or you may be thinking, well, that's a baby lion, but oh, look at that guy. Like, that guy's still pretty cute. Like, want to just snuggle up with that, right? But lions are actually some of the most powerful and terrifying predators on planet Earth. And that's a little bit more realistic of what they can do and what they can be. And so death by lions is really terrifying. In fact, I want you to put yourself in this car for a second, okay? So go ahead and check out this video and just put yourself in here.
Couldn't catch those two making out.
Okay, Dad, he's coming to the car. You're gonna have to. Yikes.
Did you video that?
Yeah, but it's not a very good one. Yikes. Holy cow, Cindy.
Oh my gosh. There you go, Kenny.
I know. Just lock the door. Oh my gosh, I didn't know they could.
Yo, that lion just opened up the car door, okay? Imagine for a second, like, thankfully, that person reacted really quickly and got that door shut. Imagine if there was nobody riding in the back seat. And like a lion jumps into the back seat. Like, what do they do? Do they jump out of the car where there's 15 other lions? Do you stay in the car with a lion in the back seat? Like, that is a terrifying situation. That lion just opened up the car door. Like, what? Now, imagine like that. Look, we go, man, if I'm trapped in a vehicle with a lion or being thrown into a pit with multiple lions, it's not going to end well. In fact, these lions would not have been well fed. These lions would have been starved so that when someone came along that was punished by being thrown to the lions, these lions were ready and waiting. Pretty serious situation. So Daniel's faced with the consequence of death by lions if he continues to pray to God. That's a pretty serious situation. Death by lions if I continue to pray to God. Now, I don't know about you. That's not necessarily the easiest decision for me to make. Like, if I'm being honest, I don't know what I've done in my life to prepare me to handle that situation. Do I pray to God knowing that I may get thrown into a pit with lions? I mean, listen, I like God. I love God. I also really like being alive, and it's like, but Daniel, and I definitely don't like being eaten by lions. It hasn't happened before, but I imagine it's not the fastest way to die, in that it would probably be pretty painful, right? So let's jump into our story. Let's see what happens next in verse 10. It says, when Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So what happens? Daniel chooses to continue to honor God, to continue to pray to God, no matter what the situation is, no matter what the consequence is, he's going to be faithful to God. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel, petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Hey, king, didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days, any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, as the law of Medes and Persians, the order stands. It is irrevocable. It is unchangeable. So then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. You know why he was displeased? Because he loved Daniel. And he realized in this moment that all these guys had actually tricked him, and that this was all one big setup, but he couldn't do anything about it. As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. Then these men went together to the king and said to him, you know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. So the king's like, man, what can I do? How can I get out of this? And these guys come back and they're like, hey, you got to do this. You got to stick to it. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of the nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Man, this is terrifying. That Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den and left to be eaten alive during the night, all because he dared to talk to God. All because he dared to talk to God. I wonder, have you ever been in a situation, in a place like Daniel was in, and obviously not literally in a lion's den, but have you ever been in a place where you did something bold for God, took a stand for what you believed in, and had to deal with some frightening consequences? Maybe that had to deal with your friends or your family. And you knew that taking a stand was going to lead to some scary consequences. Man, if you've never been in a situation like that, that's okay. But try to imagine what you might do if you were in Daniel's shoes. What would you do if you were being targeted and attacked and put in danger because of your faith? Would you continue to trust God? Would you stand firm in your convictions? Or would you say whatever you need to say to get out of the situation? I can remember in high school, it was in 1999, before any of y'all were born. one of the first major shootings in high school took place. It was Columbine High School. And it rocked our nation. We hadn't seen anything like this before. And I can remember later that day, I'm at my best friend's house across the street. And the story had come out that there was a girl named Cassie Bernal. And one of the attackers pointed a gun directly at her and said, "Do you believe in God?" And when she said yes, he pulled the trigger. And I can remember distinctively being in my best friend's house and his mom looking at her son and saying, "Do you know what you would say? You keep your mouth shut and you don't say anything about God." He didn't grow up in the same kind of Christian home that I did. And I can remember being in his house when his mom told him, "Don't you ever answer that question yes if that's asked to you like that. You save your life." Man, I pray that that situation doesn't come to any of you. But these stories aren't just thousands of years ago. These stories, this Daniel in the lion's den, isn't just some kid's story that we've heard over and over again in children's church. This stuff is playing out day in and day out in our world. Maybe not always in Bedford, Virginia, but in a few moments, I want to open your eyes to things that are going on in the rest of this world where this is a very real story. Will you stand for God? Will you have the boldness to say, "I put my trust in God no matter what, no matter the consequence. My trust and my faith is in God." Last week, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, "It doesn't matter. We're going to stand. We won't bow to anything else. If God chooses to rescue us, then so be it. But if he doesn't, then so be it." Daniel had no certainty that he would be rescued. In fact, when you think maybe in this story, you might think like, oh, he just saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get rescued from this fiery furnace. So he's probably thinking like, okay, God's got me. That was decades ago when that story happened to this story. Decades and decades ago, okay? So how often do we remember everything that God did in our lives last year, 5 years ago? How often do we remember the stuff he does a month ago? So Daniel probably wasn't in this moment thinking back of the situation that happened with his buddies and going, "I'm sure God's got this." No, he had to come to a place where he said, "It doesn't matter. I'm going to get on my knees and I'm going to pray. I don't know what's going to happen, but my trust is in God." It looks different day in and day out for you and I. But there are going to come moments, there come times, maybe it's something on here where you go, "It doesn't matter, but I'm going to put my trust in God." Maybe something in the halls of your school where maybe it's not you actually getting on your knees and praying, but it's standing up for somebody. It's sitting with somebody where you go, "Bump it. I don't care the consequences. My trust is in God." Well, let's see how this story ends. Verse 18, then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions or entertainment were brought to him, and he could not sleep. Remember, because the king is upset. He's been tricked, and he loves Daniel. And at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. And when he reached the den, he cried out in anguish, "Daniel, servant of the living God," the king said. The king said this, "Has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke with the king. "May the king live forever. My God sent an angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me. For I was found innocent before him and also before you, your majesty. I have not done harm." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. The king then gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den, they, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. That seems a little extreme at the end there. Just kind of the laws of the land. If you were to found to sort of falsely accuse somebody and they were found to be innocent, then that punishment would come on you and even your family. And so that's why we see this sort of extreme, what looks to us, you're like, wow, that might be a little bit. Well, the king was upset, and these were kind of the laws of the land as well. Notice this last part. Then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live on the whole earth. This is the king, a secular king, writing, "May your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion, people must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. For he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Man, crazy story. Daniel's life was spared because he trusted in God, even when his situation seemed completely hopeless. Daniel had no assurance that God would rescue him or that things would turn out okay. I want you to see here that taking a bold stand for God can sometimes have scary consequences. But what Daniel's story teaches us, we can't just make this correlation. If I take a bold stand for God, he will always protect me. Because Daniel didn't even do that. But he said, it doesn't matter what happens to me, I'm standing for God. You see, Daniel's story teaches us that even in the darkest, scariest, most desperate situations, God can still be trusted. God, he's still good. He's still in control. Look at that. Even in the darkest, scariest, most desperate situations, there's enough of you in this room right now to know that there's a number of you that have walked through a really dark, scary, desperate situation already in your life. I pray that you knew then that God could be trusted, that he was still good, and that he was still in control. There's many more of you that maybe you haven't. When I was your age, I hadn't walked through anything like that yet. But I was going to, and I have, and I will continue to. And I pray that when that happens, I'm able to look to God and go, he can be trusted. I know that he's still good. I know that he's still in control. When you choose to put your trust in him, peace will follow. And just like Daniel, even when things look hopeless, you can choose peace in the pit. Even when things look hopeless in this world, you can still choose peace in the pit. Now, as we began this message, I told you to stay locked in because this story is not just something that happened thousands of years ago, but something that's relevant to you right now. And you may be thinking, yeah, I hear you, Mac. Like, I may not be threatened with a lion's den, but I face pressure and temptation every day. I want you to know that you're right. You face pressure and temptation every day to conform to the patterns of this world that we've talked about. And there's a very real pressure, and there's very real scary situations that happen in your school, on social media. But I don't want to leave you there tonight. I want you to also see I want you to take off these sort of American glasses that we look at everything through. I want you to take off these sort of Bedford, Virginia glasses that we view everything through and understand what's happening in the world right now. Because sometimes we get so locked in and we think about persecution, we just look at it in our own situation. And by no means am I trying to diminish what you go through, because it's very real. But I also want you to understand what other Christians are going through. And that this story isn't just thousands of years old and it's cute, a little cute children's story. There are modern day Daniels all around this world that are having to choose peace in the pit, that are having to choose trust in God, even when it seems hopeless and they have no idea what lays ahead. And so I want you to see a picture here. This picture is the top 50 countries that Christians face persecution in. All of these. So among the world's watch list, the top 50 alone, there are 260 million Christians that face a level of persecution that is either extreme, very high, or high. 260 million Christians around the world represented in those 50 countries alone that face a level of persecution that's extreme, very high, or high. There's actually another 50 million Christians facing high levels of persecution in 23 more countries. If we add all of that up, basically what that tells us is that 1 in 8 Christians worldwide face persecution measured as extreme, very high, or high. So if there's about 65 of us in this room right now, then that means there's about 8 of us that would be facing persecution for our Christian belief that's either extreme, very high, or high. This is the sort of global situation around the world that a lot of times nobody talks about. You don't understand. Maybe nobody showed you this, or we don't generally think about it. The number one country year after year for the worst persecution is North Korea. And honestly, here in America, a lot of times we just kind of joke about North Korea. Their ruler, he's just kind of a crazy guy. It's always been this Kim family. They're just crazy and they're out there, and we kind of make these jokes about North Korea. But have you ever stopped to think there are real people living in that country that are suffering? In fact, there are real Christians, according to that, about 300,000 Christians living in that country. Look at this picture. That whole Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and a 90-foot statue that they were supposed to bow to 2,000, 3,000 years ago, not so far removed from our world today. These are about 90-foot statues in North Korea of the Kim family that people will bow to. The reason North Korea is number one is because, you see, the Kim family is regarded as gods. And so if you are to pray to anybody or anything else, that's to say that that person must have authority over the Kim family. And they are considered gods in that country. One story of a person who escaped from North Korea goes like this. When we escaped from North Korea to China, Christian missionaries looked after us. One day we were in the church service and all of a sudden the Chinese police entered. My son, granddaughter, and I had managed to escape through a hidden route, but my daughter was arrested in front of her 2-year-old daughter. My daughter was sent back to North Korea, and because of her Christian faith, she was sent to a prison camp. We haven't heard anything from her since then. My granddaughter barely remembers her mother's face. I've got a 2-year-old child in a room just behind us. To think that his mother could get taken from him, and he might not even remember what her face looks like, and we would never hear from her again. These are modern day situations. You see, Christians in North Korea, they have three options, basically. Attempt to escape to another country where you can be open about your faith, but the journey is dangerous and illegal, and you may not be successful. Or stay in North Korea and give up on your faith. Or stay in North Korea and keep your faith a secret, knowing that if you're discovered, you'll be imprisoned, tortured, and almost certainly killed. Like I said, I'm not trying to minimize the pressures that you face, but I want you to understand the world that we live in. And I want you to understand that this story of Daniel thousands of years ago is very relevant to what you're facing today and to what Christians in our world are facing today. And so as we close, I want to share with you one last story as the band comes up. You see, just a few months ago in September, a lot of you took part in See You at the Pole. And thankfully, each of our schools had a great turnout. And it was awesome. It's a great time for students to gather around and to pray for their schools. Well, I remember catching a hold of a story that happened that went viral. And it revolved around this picture. I don't even know where it is. But you see, this young man stood alone at that pole. And cars drove by. And they began to take pictures and post it. And this thing sort of turned viral in the morning. And social media in their area was going crazy with it. In fact, someone recognized who it was and sent this to his mom and said, look at what is being said about your son, where people were saying positive things and proud of him taking a stand. And he, meanwhile, is sitting in class with no idea what's going on. And his mom gets a hold of him, and later on, she talks with him after school. And he said as he stood alone and prayed that the cry of his heart had been, God, as people drive by, let them wonder. Let their hearts be pricked. He laughed and said, it's crazy because it's like he answered this in a big way. He said at first he thought he would simply pray until somebody else showed up, right? Like, okay, I guess maybe some people are running late. Maybe they'll be here in a minute. So I'm just, you know what, I'll pray, and I'm sure a bunch of people will show up. Eventually he realized no one was coming, and a cry of his heart changed. And so he asked that God would do something with his standing alone. Listen, I'm thankful that you guys didn't have to do that this past September, that you have this. Would you have, though? What if you were the first one there and nobody was there? Would you have said, it doesn't matter. I don't know, whatever comes of this, whatever people say about me today, it doesn't matter. I'm going to pray to my God. I'm not going to hide it. I mean, it would have been really easy. What's the difference of him praying to God, of just going back to his car? He probably doesn't drive, but going into the classroom and just kind of, but instead he said, no, I'm going to be faithful out in the open, just like Daniel, with the windows open. I'm going to pray to God. I'm going to be bold and take a bold stand here. You'll probably never face the kind of persecution that other Christians around this world do, that are facing day in and day out. But being bold for your faith, it's still scary. It's still very real here today. So as we close, the invitation is simple. I'm going to invite you guys to just worship. But as you worship, I want you to talk to God. I want you to pray that you will put your trust in God. Maybe you go, I do trust God, but I don't know how much. Ask him, God, I trust you, but will you help me to trust you even more? We don't know what the future holds. We don't know where the next pit is coming. We could wake up tomorrow and face a situation like I talked about when I was in high school. The honest truth of our society and what we live around today is that we could face a situation like Columbine tomorrow. We don't know. I pray that the worst that comes of standing for your faith is that you simply might lose a friend here or there, maybe get laughed at a little bit. But I also pray that your faith and your trust in God is willing to say, no matter the outcome, my trust in God isn't something that's just calculated and saying, okay, I've got this much, and well, if the consequence is this, then I'm out. How do we get to a point to have that faith and that trust like Daniel does, where we go, it doesn't matter what the consequence is, my trust is there. I don't care if the consequence is here or if it's all the way down there. It doesn't matter if I lose my followers on Instagram or if I lose my life. My trust is in God, because the only reason I have this life is because of God. So would you worship God and pray for that tonight? Father, help us. God, would you help me? We live in a world where these pits will come and go. I know there are some in this room right now. They may be in the darkest, scariest pit they've ever walked through. And tonight's message hits them right where they're at, of going, God, help me. I want to put my trust in you, but I don't know. God, it just seems so scary. What's going to happen? God, would you bring us all to a place where we could answer that question? That story never mentions Daniel being afraid or not being afraid. It just said that he put his trust in you. God, he was a human dude. I'm sure there was fear. Just like there will be fear in us when these moments in life come. Would you give us the strength to push past that and put our trust in you and choose peace in the pit instead of anxiety and worry and depression? God, help us to be bold for you. You have given us so much. We are so blessed in this country to have the opportunity to speak freely about you. May we not throw that away. Help us. Strengthen us to walk day in and day out, putting our trust in you. In Jesus' name, amen.